Hey everybody, welcome to TCP-Talks with Jonathan Baker and Justin Broadley from the Cloud Pod. In this series, we're bringing you interviews with the best and brightest leaders and heroes from the tech and cloud industry.
Andrew, it's great for you to join us today. Can you maybe introduce yourself to our audience?
Yeah, thanks for having me on the show. My name's Andrew Krug. I am the lead of the security advocacy team at DataDog. And that's what I've been doing for about 3 years or so since DataDog decided to launch its first security product.
Yeah, it's actually interesting, talking to you before the show, learning about how DataDog is starting to think more about security and going into a lot of different spaces in the security side. Because I think a lot of people have this illusion that DataDog is just an observability tool. And I think it's becoming really an interesting common location for all data around your observability, your security, and your performance of your application. So really exciting to see DataDog making big strides in this area.
Yeah, we are as well.
So for those of you who have never heard of DataDog, which every vendor conference I've been to has a very large DataDog booth. So I don't know how many people there are, but thinking about DataDog, how would you describe DataDog and some of those security solutions to someone who's maybe new to the product?
So I think historically, the way I would have framed this is that we're very focused on the pillars, the 3 pillars of observability. But today we are focused on taking those things that were the traditional observability pillars and using the same data for providing this security lens kind of on top of data that you probably already actually have in platform. So previously, your statement would be totally accurate. We were definitely mired in and led the way in the observability space for a long time. But today I would say that we are heavily focused on security and bringing security really to engineering teams, not to just security people.
Great. Datadog being a SaaS product versus open source solutions that I might deploy on premise, like Elasticsearch or others. What are some of the benefits of leveraging a solution like Datadog that is a SaaS product?
I think one of the biggest advantages of using any vendor-provided solution, really, and not just Datadog's, and maybe this is helpful if you're evaluating what vendor to choose, is in the way that vendor is ingesting and normalizing various log sources for you. So anyone that's run a DIY SIEM, run an open source SIEM or security information event manager, the way that you detect when different things are going bad in your environment. If you have done that before, you know that it's very, very challenging sometimes to maintain a sane data structure for logs that are ingested, especially from cloud providers. Cloud provider audit logs are notorious for even having different data types in single fields across product families, even in the same cloud provider. So something that, for example, is a string for one product might be a list in another product, or a list of dictionaries in another product. So I think the big value that the vendors bring is that confidence that they have these large teams that are really focused on ensuring that things are working 100% of the time for you as a user of that platform, as well as the out-of-box detections. And we could talk deeply about how we engineer those out-of-box detections, but those are the rules that everybody should have on 100% of the time, and they immediately bring value when you turn that product on.
I think you just took me back to the days trying to get Snort to work at scale. I blocked those memories out, but as you talked about that, and I'm trying to keep this team running on, trying to keep Snort working on several thousand nodes, I really understand what you're saying in this particular space.
Yeah, or OSSEC and thousands of projects, things that you got to maintain. That was fun times. So, in terms of evaluating security tooling, I've had experience with many different commercial and open source solutions over the years, and I've often found it very difficult to kind of feel like I'm actually drawing any value from the tool whatsoever, because it's either you get no alerts or you get so many alerts they're just inactionable. If a customer approaches you, how would you sort of explain to them or walk them through the process of successful evaluation of a tool?
Yeah, that's a hot topic, because I think as vendors, everybody struggles with how in a trial with a customer do you provide somebody enough signal that they feel like they're getting value out of that product as they're evaluating it. But then also at the same time, nobody wants to be inundated with alerts, as you mentioned, that are totally inactionable. So I think that great security solutions, especially on the SIM side, start with alerts that you are 100% confident as a customer that you would act on. And if it is shipping with a lot of alerts that you would never act on, maybe that's not the right fit for your needs as a company, because everybody's threat model is going to be slightly different. Of course, there are those things based on cloud platform, that we can look at kind of top 10 style attacks, and we can know, what is the cloud maturity of a specific vendor based on whether or not they're detecting those specific cloud provider types of attacks. So examples would be like disabling CloudTrail logging, or doing advanced attacks to leverage encryption to make it so that an incident response team can't read the logs even if they're being shipped. So awareness of things like that and looking at the cloud friendliness for your stack, I think, is also really critical anytime that you're thinking of evaluating a new product.
Are there any security simulation tools or anything that we can use to actually prove these things in a otherwise secure environment?
Yeah, I think that's kind of a nice segue as well, because one of the things I think that's great about our stance is that we really like to be very active in the open source community, and we like to give a lot back to groups like Cloud Native Computing Foundation, Linux Foundation. We also have our own open source tool projects, one of which we released about 2 years ago now, is Stratus Red Team, which is kind of our answer to how do you take the techniques and tactics of attackers and then simulate them inside of a clean room environment to test out these different detection platforms. So Stratus, I think at the last time that I gave a talk on it, I'm sure it's more today, had at least 36 different attack tactics it could emulate for AWS, and another dozen or so for Kubernetes. It also has Azure and Google Cloud support now too, and it's one of our most popular open source security tools.
That's awesome. I'll check that out, actually. In terms of, when there are findings, what's your strategy around classifying those in terms of severity and risk?
I think criticality of findings is a really interesting conversation that everybody's starting to have in a different way. So previously, we would have said anytime that there's an attack, that's worth notifying somebody. And I think today we're all living in kind of a leaner environment. We're working with smaller teams. We're asking engineering teams to do more. The DevSecOps movement has kind of really shifted the accountability model there. So when we talk about the context of how critical is an alert, it's always nice to put that risk lens on it for the business. So in context, is that asset that's being attacked successfully, what data is it holding? How's the data classified? If it was, successfully breached, is there going to be a financial damage, reputation damage, lost productivity, and then scaling out kind of the run book for that, like what's somebody going to do in that case based on understanding of risk.
Are you seeing people automate responses to things, or is it still very much a manual process?
I think the most successful teams right now are doing kind of a hybrid process. Like everything else, they're not using only automation or only run books that a human is going through. They're actually involving a human at the critical steps that they make a decision point, and then letting that human kind of run an automation that'll go and execute the plan. I think one of the things that teams are really struggling with when it comes to being high maturity at DevOps, let's say, and also trying to automate incident handling or response to highly critical alerts, is that actually can cause configuration drift. And so a lot of people are really hesitant to go in and have those fully automated run books because it's going to totally mess up the state of their Terraform or something, because even the best response tools are just making API calls. So I see people doing all kinds of things, but having that person still at the heart of the incident handling process that's making those hard choices is still key.
Yeah, I don't think we'll ever see those people go away. Even in terms of disaster recovery, failovers and things, people are always hesitant to make it an automated process just in case. And so there's usually a person in the loop, and I think that makes a lot of sense.
There's still a lot of value in having it as code, right? So that a human is just pushing buttons, and so it's like a human assist that ensures consistency, right? Because I like to say, humans are awesome unless you want really consistent results, and that's where kind of automating part of the process comes into play.
Yeah, as you think about all the buzzwords that exist in security right now, XDR, threat hunting, all these different areas, it all kind of rolls back into, how do you get that data in front of a SOC team? And the most traditional ways is kind of a SIM. How do you think Datadog is changing that mindset? Because I think it's a different approach, which I really appreciate.
Yeah, so we definitely have an excellent SIM product, Datadog Cloud SIM. It was the very first product that we launched, which I kind of alluded to a bit earlier. The SIM really came about as a way that Datadog thought it could help customers that were already customers of logs. Because as anybody knows that's launched a SIM inside of their company, one of the most challenging things is actually getting the data from all of the endpoints into the thing that is analyzing that data and then providing alerts. And so immediately we were already meeting engineers where they were and where they were already shipping logs. So that's like thing number one is having that engineering team in the same system as the security team, and it's not as heavy a lift. In terms of just the user experience, I think that our SIM is incredibly easy to use in the sense that you don't have to be a security expert to write custom alerts for that SIM. It has a really simple UI that you can use. Of course, if you have DevOps at a high maturity, we have all those Terraform providers and things as well. But quite frankly, I think that over time, we're going to see teams shift away from the SIM as the primary way that they're doing detection.
I think one of the big challenges I've always had with the SIM is that it doesn't have the context that's really necessary to understand, or the layers of the onion, as we talk about often in security, where you have different layers of protection. And the SAN controller might have a really high vulnerability, but it's also 12 layers deep in my network. So it can't really be a sub 1 security issue. When if someone got to it and is actually attacking it, we have other problems.
Yeah, and also, SIMs don't necessarily always scale as well as the business would like it to. Either it doesn't scale from a performance perspective or it doesn't scale from a cost perspective. And of course, we can keep up with customer events at cloud scale, but not every customer is going to want to pay to ingest, analyze, et cetera, every single log line from every endpoint inside of their company. So you need sort of to think of it as a bit more of a funnel of, how much of this detection can I move out to the edge or the endpoint, and then really use a SIM for correlative finding. So look at more of the context and provide more data to somebody who is going through and doing forensics or incident response or trying to assess the severity of a major breach.
We've talked on the podcast many times about the value of structured logging and how we can't believe that even in 2023, people are still using syslog and logging very verbose text messages, impossible to parse. I mean, is it possible to deploy a SIM without having sort of sensibly structured logs? I mean, is it really a prereq to success there?
It's very difficult to deploy a SIM on top of completely unstructured logs, and I think that's another area where just by virtue of the fact that folks were already using us for log ingestion, and we have this pipeline concept where you can go in and we have all these standard parsers, regex, grok parse. Maybe in a worst case, it is structured, but then there's escaped JSON inside of a single value. being able to quickly extract all that and then normalize it to a set of security attributes is going to continue to be really, really essential, right? Because otherwise, we're just kind of tokenizing blobs of text and trying to do analytics on them, which has been, a detection and response strategy for some vendors, creating these security data lakes and then applying a bit more of an ML process. But the tried and true is always going to work, right? That concept of yanking out specific things, mapping them to standard attributes, because it's the only way that we can really do things like track the path of an attacker across multiple systems with different log formats. So I still think it's going to be critical for many years to come.
Yeah, I guess because APM already requires structure to its logging, that seems like an ideal place to tie in these security features.
Yeah, more standardization always lends itself to better detection.
Amazing. If you do standards, you can find deviations better. What a concept. I noticed one of the areas that you guys have focused on a little bit too is in cloud security posture management. And really, going back to your comment you made earlier about the biggest problem is humans. That's one of the big challenges we see quite often in cloud security is, public S3 buckets and things. As you are out there talking to customers and you're thinking about the issues that you run into, what do you see as kind of the trends? Is it still really S3 public buckets or wide open databases on the internet that are really the big issues, or do you think it's getting more nuanced and more complicated now?
It really depends on the maturity of the company. We actually did back in December, one of the folks in my team did a cloud incident roundup that we published on DataDog's Security Labs. So if you're interested in last year's holistic report of the trends, you can go check that out there. But, we still do see the things that you would think of as very boring, hygienic, easy to detect things causing major breaches for very large, very mature companies. And that is not necessarily always the public S3 bucket scenario, but it still is a large percentage of the time. And those incidents are very impactful. We also see things that we saw in data centers before cloud ever existed, which was that you have this great firewall and the last line that's evaluated is permit any, and the comment below it is just like temporary troubleshooting rule. And those things are still the root cause for a lot of incidents. And yeah, to your point, that is where posture management does come into play. Assume that people will make mistakes. Assume that you need to score those and act on them, not immediately necessarily all the time to be impactful, but like within hours, not seconds, would have prevented so many large breaches.
I remember back in the early 2000s, there was a fun game we used to play where we take a Windows 98 laptop and we just put it on the internet and see how long it took to get owned. So yeah, those minutes matter. And it was shockingly fast back in those days. And I imagine it's still pretty fast, but I don't have that kind of time anymore. But yeah, it's really interesting to see, the speed of security issues is rapidly increasing. The need to be able to leverage tools like Datadog or combined with things like WAF and other tools is really critical to being able to be successful and to deal with the live threat, landscape that we're seeing in the market. Where do you see kind of Datadog going and kind of the next levels of this, and as they continue to expand their portfolio, at least that you can share with us?
Yeah, I think in general, no official predictions for the roadmap. I don't get that. I get that information at the same time as you do, but the general direction I think the industry is going is to move a lot of these detections closer to the data that they're securing. So when you think about, cloud workload security, how are we monitoring things at the endpoint with things like our application security management product, which is more or less what Gartner used to call a RASP, or real-time application security platform. Basically, it's a fancy WAF, right? That is actually embedded in the runtime of the software itself. And so we're really seeing this shift where security is moving not just left in the CI/CD pipeline, but it's also moving into the running application stack itself. So it's like have all these checks in your CI/CD and have your CSPM, but then also verify that bad things still aren't happening by examining the application runtimes in real time. And we're just going to see more and more of that, I would predict.
Yeah, I was reviewing for the State of AWS Security report that Datadog published last year. And, of course, IAM was your big hot button in that report. And, I'm curious, how does Datadog help solve the IAM challenge? Because I think that's, especially for people new to the cloud, IAM is probably the hardest to wrap your head around, and least privilege, getting better at least privilege concepts. How do you guys see that evolving, and how does Datadog help us solve IAM challenges that you identified?
So I think this is one area where CSPM is really, really helpful in kind of evaluating like what you would think of as incredibly dangerous policies. But over the next little while, I think you're going to see more workflow around managing how people are gaining access. So one of the hot topics, for example, in the identity space is even just time-based access for these privileged grants. So how in a safe way can a developer request access, be granted that access with a maximum lifetime on it, and then that access goes away automatically. And I think this is a case where, cloud providers are not necessarily incentivized to make identity really, really secure by default. They're incentivized to provide you services that you can pay for. So it's not part of that paved road user onboarding experience in a prominent way that makes people architect really, really secure identity models. And no particular cloud is at fault here. It's just not the way that things were for a long, long time.
I mean, I do hold them slightly accountable because they choose really insecure practices in some of their documentation as examples, which then people copy paste and kind of move. So I do feel they have some responsibility to the market, and then even in some of their managed policies on AWS, they're a little bit overly. They have too much holes, too many issues that can come out of them, and you think you're secure because you're using a managed policy. And of course, Amazon should know best. And the reality is that's not the case. So I do think they own some responsibility in it, but yes, they don't own it completely, as they are motivated to make money.
There's a lot CSPs can do to be helpful, but I think we're swinging the pendulum in the right direction with new things like AWS Access Analyzer, a great tool that people use to evaluate policies. It's $0, so everybody's just going to turn it on, of course, once they find out that it exists. And it's going to help start to close those gaps. But for so long, people onboarded to cloud provider environments, and there was not enough prescriptive guidance in the UIs. There wasn't enough prescriptive guidance from the vendor. And so now we're really starting to assess that, I think, as an industry. And that is this thing that people are now calling CHEM or CIEM, the Cloud Identity Entitlement Management platforms. And that's going to be a huge wave of products, and it'll be interesting to see kind of how it evolves over the next year or so.
Yeah, I mean, if the role only gave you read access to everything, what could possibly go wrong?
Yeah, it's very interesting when you think about as a customer now, when I show up on day one, I'm going to move my stuff into the cloud provider environment, and then I'm going to bring in a vendor to do detection. I'm going to bring in a vendor to do configuration scanning continuously. I'm going to bring in a vendor for a web application firewall. And in a lot of industries, WAFs will actually be required for the first time by compliance next year. And then on top of that, I'm also going to delegate access to a vendor and trust that vendor to make changes to my identity policy. So we live in a crazy world where we put a lot of confidence in all of these baskets.
Yeah, it's quite a big ask, is trusting somebody to make fundamental changes to IAM.
And it's very different than, just a vendor that's scanning your environment and reporting on misconfigurations, being able to go in and take actions at that level of privilege. That's a different level of trust and a different engineering problem, I think.
Yeah, definitely. So in terms of we've talked about traditional SIEMs and what they do for us, and now we're talking about the next generation of shift left and trust but verify. What does the output from that look like for engineers and the SOC team? What new information are you bringing, and how is it of value?
Yeah, I think what it ultimately looks like for engineering teams is having information surfacing in the areas where they're already kind of used to looking, and that's kind of the way that we think about it when we think about the way that Datadog's security products all work together. So you have a single unified view that shows not just what are the issues, but the issues are also sorted in order of importance, and that comes back to that conversation we're having about criticality. How do I know when something is maximum risk versus low risk? And the differentiator could be that it's happening in production. It's happening with real user data. So the more of that context that we pull together, it really allows people to act, intelligently. So the 3 a.m. problem comes up again. When do you wake somebody up versus not? That's a big piece of it. And then, when do you require action inside of a specific service level objective or a specific time window? I think that answered the question.
Yeah, it did. Yeah, my mind's just kind of drifting back to some of the vulnerabilities I've heard of over the past year or so. People like Slack accidentally sending user tokens to all participants in a chat and things like that. It seem like ideal candidates for this type of technology.
Yeah, credential management and credential leaks also continue to be kind of a root cause of security incidents, and that comes a little bit back to the identity conversation. But it also just comes down to being able to detect those leaks in a manner that's faster than attackers can detect them. Bit of an arms race on the security of secrets side of things.
Yeah, that's right. You don't need to outrun the alligator, you just need to outrun your friend.
If people are interested in learning more, I know there's a webinar coming up. Maybe you could introduce us to the upcoming webinar and tell people how to find it, as well as how to find you on the internet to ask you questions.
Yeah, so we have a upcoming security observability day. I believe it is April 18th, and that link is available on the Datadog HQ Twitter if you want to sign up and register for the next what we used to call demo day. Basically, it's a roundup of all the products, a little bit of a sneak peek on where the products are headed. And of course, we love to engage with you during those things. So if you have questions, if you have comments, curiosities, you can reach out to me, of course, on Twitter as well. I'm at Andrew Krug, AndrewKrug on Twitter. Or I'm also in the Datadog community Slack, which if you haven't taken the time to join our community Slack, it's full of practitioners using Datadog, some of the not Datadog users discussing all kinds of DevOps and now recently security issues. You can also look for more content from us on Datadog Security Labs, which is just securitylabs.datadoghq.com.
Well, I think we covered a lot today. What Datadog can help you do in your security space, talking about the SIEM and the involvement of the SIEM in your organization, as well as some of the great open source tools like Stratus, Red Team, and some of the others. So really appreciate you coming on board today and talking about this with us. And we love to have you back on in the future to talk about more Datadog and security.
Yeah, thanks for having me, and definitely look out for more updates and open source tools.
Thanks, Andrew.
Thanks.
Visit thecloudpod.net to subscribe to the show, join our Slack channel, or sign up for our weekly newsletter. You can also find information on reaching our audience through a CloudPod sponsorship opportunity. A big thank you to today's guest, and thank you for listening.